Imagine walking into a quiet mountain town where the snow falls gently, covering every street in silence, and then discovering that beneath that silence lies a secret so dark it could shatter lives forever. This is the story of courage, of a loyal German shepherd who refused to stay silent, and of the people who found hope in the darkest places. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments, I'd love to know. And if you believe in the power of second chances, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this again. Wishing you a blessed and beautiful day. Now, let's begin. Snow fell in steady curtains over the small Montana town of Red Haven, a place that looked as though it had been carved out of the wilderness and frozen in time. Wooden storefronts lined Main Street, their roofs buried beneath the weight of a long winter, and smoke rose lazily from chimneys that dotted the distant ridges. The air was sharp, so cold it stung the lungs with every breath, and even the neon sign of Jackson's Market flickered dimly, as though exhausted by the endless dark of February. Inside the store, fluorescent lights hummed above aisles filled with the ordinary, stacks of cereal, piles of potatoes, a cooler of milk. Yet on that particular evening, the ordinary was about to give way to something terrible. Ethan Cole moved through the sliding doors with the slow confidence of a man who had walked into countless places just like it. Not because he wanted to, but because his job demanded it. At 39, Ethan carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades as a police officer. His frame was tall and broad-shouldered, but the lines around his storm-gray eyes hinted at sleepless nights and memories that refused to loosen their grip. His short, dark brown hair, already peppered with gray, was kept neat beneath his navy winter patrol coat, and his jaw bore the rough shadow of stubble, the mark of a man too tired to shave with precision. Years ago, Ethan had lost his daughter in a car accident, a wound that had carved into him so deeply it had reshaped not just his heart, but his very sense of duty. He had chosen to stay in Red Haven, a quiet town where everyone knew everyone, partly because it was safe and partly because he had no strength left for the chaos of bigger cities. Yet inside him lived a restless ache, one he carried like an unspoken vow. He would never let another child suffer if he could prevent it. At his side padded Rook, a German shepherd of 5 years, whose thick coat of black and silver fur gleamed under the market's lights. Rook's amber eyes were sharp, intelligent, and restless, scanning every corner of the store as though danger hid behind stacks of flour and displays of oranges. A scar along his left flank told a story no words could. Rook had been injured once during a raid in Helena, but he had returned stronger, more attuned to his handler's every movement. Trained in search, apprehension, and rescue, he had earned a reputation not only for his skill, but for a strange intuition, the kind of instinct that often went beyond training. Ethan had come to rely on it more than he cared to admit, for there were times when Rook seemed to sense truth long before any human could. The market smelled faintly of bread and disinfectant, the mingled sense of comfort and sterility. A few shoppers pushed carts down the aisles, their boots squeaking against the wet floor. Near the dairy section, a mother juggled 2 toddlers, her expression weary but patient. 2 teenagers lingered by the frozen pizzas, laughing in whispers that echoed too loudly in the quiet store. Nothing seemed unusual, and Ethan offered the smallest nods of acknowledgement as he passed familiar faces. He wasn't there for trouble, just a routine check, a chance to remind folks that the badge still had presence in Red Haven. But Rook stopped. He stopped so abruptly that Ethan nearly stumbled. The shepherd's hackles rose, his muscles stiffened, and a low rumble built in his chest. His body became a living barrier, planted firmly in the middle of the aisle, eyes locked on something Ethan had not yet seen. Ethan tightened his grip on the leash, glancing down in confusion. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice calm, but his pulse quickening. Rook did not move. His gaze was fixed at the far end of the dairy aisle, ears forward, lips curling into a restrained growl. Following that line of sight, Ethan saw a man, average height, maybe late 30s, wearing a plaid shirt and dark jeans, a ball cap pulled low enough to shadow most of his face. At first glance he looked unremarkable, the kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But what he carried was not ordinary. In his arms was a little girl, no older than 2. her blonde curls falling across her pale cheek as she lay against his shoulder. She was quiet. Too quiet. Children that young rarely stayed still in strangers' arms, yet this one didn't stir, didn't cry, didn't even blink. The growl in Rook's throat deepened, and then, without warning, he lunged forward, muscles coiling with raw energy. Ethan's arm jerked as he yanked back hard on the leash, his shoulder nearly wrenched from its socket. The shepherd barked with a ferocity that shook the quiet market, the sound so sudden and primal that heads snapped around instantly. A woman screamed, dropping a carton of eggs that splattered across the tile. The laughter of the teenagers cut short, and the chatter of the aisles dissolved into tense silence. The man turned, his movements sharp and wrong. He clutched the girl tighter and began walking faster toward the exit. Ethan's instincts, honed by years of watching people make choices under pressure, screamed at him. Something wasn't right. "Sir," Ethan called, his voice carrying authority, hand lifting to display his badge. "I need to speak with you." The man didn't slow. "I didn't do anything," he barked back, his voice harsh, too defensive. His pace quickened, his boots squeaking against the wet floor. Sweat gleamed on his temple, though the store was cool. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between the man and the sliding doors, his frame blocking the exit. "Let's just talk outside," he said, calm but firm. "You'll need to show me some ID." The man's jaw tightened. "Get your dog away from me," he snapped, though his voice cracked with panic. The child in his arms remained limp, her face turned into his shoulder as though hiding, or worse. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Is she all right?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would not be simple. "She's my niece," the man said too quickly. "She's sick. I'm taking her home." Ethan's jaw clenched. He'd heard lies before. They always came too fast, too neat. He took a step forward. "You're not going anywhere until we clear this up." And then it happened. The man shoved past a display of oranges, nearly knocking it over, and bolted. The store erupted in chaos. Carts rattling, people shouting, children crying. Ethan's instincts surged into motion. He released the leash. "Rook, go!" he commanded. The shepherd became a blur, tearing down the aisle with precision and speed, weaving between carts and screaming shoppers, eyes locked on the target. Ethan charged after him, his boots pounding the tile, his coat flaring behind him. At the far corner near the pharmacy, the man tried to cut through, but he wasn't fast enough. Rook launched with explosive force, colliding with the man and dragging him to the ground. The child tumbled gently aside, sitting up in confusion but miraculously unharmed. Ethan dropped to his knees, securing the girl first, checking her pulse and breath before turning his attention to the man pinned beneath Rook's weight. "Police!" Ethan barked, his voice cutting through the din. "You're not going anywhere." He snapped cuffs onto the man's wrists, reading him his rights as shoppers gathered at a distance. Their fear mingled with awe. The store was no longer just a store. It was the beginning of something much darker. Ethan could feel it, the chill of it settling into his bones. Rook stood over the man, chest heaving, eyes alert, tail rigid. The little girl blinked up at Ethan, silent still, her lips parted as though words had been lost somewhere too deep to find. Ethan pulled her gently into his arms, his heart tightening with the weight of her silence. He glanced once more at the shepherd, his partner, his compass in moments like these. Rook met his eyes and did not look away. And near the checkout, unnoticed by most, stood a woman. She had paused with her basket of groceries, her brown eyes fixed on the scene with both horror and recognition. Sarah Bennett was 35, tall and willowy, her auburn hair pinned back in a simple bun that framed a face marked by quiet determination. She had recently moved to Red Haven from Spokane after years working as a social services coordinator. Life had left her scarred too. Her younger brother had gone missing when she was a child, a wound that had shaped her career and her resolve to protect children. She often appeared serious, her slender frame upright, her hands always folded neatly as if bracing herself against the world's chaos. Yet those who knew her well understood she carried a gentleness beneath the armor, a tenderness reserved for those most in need. And when her eyes fell on the trembling child and the shepherd who stood guard, something stirred within her, a memory, a purpose, and the sense that she had just stepped into the middle of a story much larger than herself. Ethan rose slowly, the child in his arms, the suspect groaning beneath Rook's weight, and in that frozen aisle of Jackson's Market, the threads of fate tightened. This was no routine patrol. It was the first unraveling of a secret that had been buried too long. The fluorescent lights of the Red Haven precinct buzzed faintly as if echoing the tension that had followed Ethan Cole from the frozen aisles of Jackson's Market. The storm outside still battered the streets, its icy winds rattling the windows and carrying with them the kind of chill that crept into bones and lingered there. Ethan pushed through the double doors with the little girl held close to his chest, her blonde curls pressed against his navy coat, her silence more unnerving than any scream might have been. At his heels walked Rook, his German shepherd, the dog's amber eyes alert, body rigid with the memory of the chase. Behind them, 2 officers in uniform shuffled to keep up, guiding the handcuffed man into an interrogation room at the far end of the hall. The child was set down gently in the break room, a modest space with a humming vending machine and the faint smell of burnt coffee. Ethan crouched before her, searching her pale face for some sign, fear, anger, anything. But the girl sat still, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes refusing to meet his. It was as though she had sealed herself away from the world. He offered her a cup of water, even a packet of crackers from the machine, but she did not move. Rook settled beside her, his broad frame pressed close, his head tilted in a watchful guard. For the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of response. The girl's tiny fingers brushed against the shepherd's fur, hesitant but real, as if she trusted the animal more than any human. A knock sounded at the doorway. Sarah Bennett stepped in, the grocery bag she had abandoned at the market long gone. She had changed her coat for a plain gray sweater, her auburn hair pulled into a loose braid that softened her sharp cheekbones. Her tall, willowy frame seemed almost out of place in the cramped break room, but her presence carried a quiet steadiness. "May I?" she asked softly, her voice low so as not to startle the child. Ethan gave a nod. Sarah set down a small cloth satchel she had brought with her, one of the habits she had carried since her work as a social services coordinator. Inside were crayons, a worn teddy bear with one ear missing, and a notebook filled with stickers. She placed them on the table within reach. The girl's eyes flickered once toward the teddy bear, but then dropped again, her lips pressing together in silence. Sarah lowered herself onto the floor, crossing her long legs, her posture deliberately unthreatening. She spoke gently, not asking questions, but narrating simple observations. "These crayons are red and blue. This Teddy's name is Benny. He looks like he's been loved for a very long time." She did not expect answers. She knew from experience that children in trauma needed space more than they needed interrogation. Ethan watched with quiet respect. He had read Sarah's file earlier that month when she arrived in Red Haven. 35, trained in social work, she had. Transferred after leaving Spokane's larger system, where she had handled dozens of child neglect cases. What the file did not mention, but Ethan had since learned, was that Sarah's younger brother had disappeared when she was 11. The case had never been solved, and that wound had shaped her, hardening her edges but also igniting her relentless compassion. She could be stern, uncompromising with bureaucracy, but with children, she carried the patience of someone who understood suffering in her bones. The silence was broken by Officer Mark Hendricks stepping into the room. Mark was in his mid-40s, thick-set with thinning blonde hair and a perpetually furrowed brow. He was dependable but worn, the kind of officer who had spent too many years on night shifts and too few on vacations. "Ethan," he said, his voice gravelly, "we've run the guy's prints. Nothing. No ID, no records, like he doesn't exist." His eyes shifted toward the child. "She hasn't said a word?" Ethan shook his head. "Not a sound." Mark's frown deepened. "That's not good." Sarah spoke softly without turning her gaze from the child. "It's not unusual." She's in shock. Forcing her will only push her further away. Ethan leaned back against the counter, his arms folded, his storm-gray eyes narrowing as he considered the weight of her words. He wasn't used to standing still in situations like this. Action was his default. Yet here, action felt useless. Hours passed. The precinct slowed into the rhythm of a winter night. Phones ringing less often. the clatter of boots on linoleum fading. Ethan remained in the break room, watching as Sarah tried small gestures, humming a lullaby, offering stickers, even just sitting silently in shared space. Nothing broke through. Yet, whenever Rook shifted, the girl's eyes followed, and once, when the shepherd rested his head on her lap, her lips trembled as if a word might surface. But it never did. The interrogation yielded little. Through the one-way glass, Ethan watched the suspect sit in silence, his plaid shirt stained from the scuffle, his cap removed to reveal close-cropped hair and eyes that held no warmth. The man gave a name, Daniel Price, but the databases came back empty. His story about being the girl's uncle collapsed under the simplest questions. Where did she go to daycare? What was her mother's name? No answers, only silence or vague deflections. It was as if the man had been carved out of nothing, a ghost wearing flannel. By midnight, frustration simmered through the precinct. Ethan paced the hallway, his boots heavy against the tile. He paused at the map board where open cases were pinned, faces of missing children, dates scribbled in red, threads of string connecting leads that went nowhere. He felt the ache in his chest, the old memory of his daughter's laugh, her absence pressing against him like a stone he could never put down. Rook brushed against, his leg grounding him in the present. Sarah approached quietly, her presence softer than the storm outside. She trusts him, she said, nodding toward Rook, who sat just beyond the break room doorway. That's something. It means she still believes in safety, even if only a little. Ethan gave a short nod. But not in people. Sarah's eyes, brown and steady, met his. It takes time. For a brief moment, Ethan saw the echo of his own grief mirrored in her gaze, and it unsettled him more than he expected. Mark returned with an update. No match on the girl either. No missing child report fits her description. It's like she just doesn't exist. He scratched the back of his neck, his broad frame filling the doorway. That scares me more than anything. Ethan's jaw tightened. Kids don't just not exist, he muttered. Somebody's hiding her. The break room felt colder despite the heater humming in the corner. The girl sat curled in the chair, clutching the teddy bear Sarah had offered, her small frame swallowed by the oversized uniform jacket Ethan had draped around her shoulders. She looked like a ghost of childhood, present but unreachable. And in that silence, Ethan felt the stirrings of something he hadn't in years, a responsibility that went beyond duty, beyond the badge, beyond the protocols. This wasn't just another case. It was the beginning of something deeper, something dangerous, and he knew instinctively that Rook had sensed it first. Outside, the storm raged against Red Haven's windows, but inside, the quiet was heavier than the snow. The suspect sat behind glass, silent and sweating. The girl clutched the shepherd's fur as though it were her lifeline. Sarah remained, her patience unbroken, her determination clear. And Ethan Cole, weary and scarred though he was, stood between them all, feeling the shape of a truth he couldn't yet name. The next morning, the storm over Red Haven had thinned into a brittle silence, the kind that left a thin crust of ice over car windshields and coated the pine branches along Main Street in a frozen glaze. The precinct smelled of coffee that had burned too long on the hot plate, mingled with the faint trace of wet wool from coats hung by the door. Ethan Cole sat at his desk, the girl from the market asleep on a folded blanket in the break room under Sarah Bennett's watch. She hadn't spoken a word through the night, though she had clutched the battered teddy bear to her chest with surprising strength. Rook was restless. The German shepherd paced the corridor with a steady rhythm, his nails clicking against the linoleum, pausing every so often at the evidence room. His black and silver coat gleamed under the harsh lights, his scar along the flank tightening as his muscles flexed, his nose lifted, catching scents no one else seemed to notice, his amber eyes sharp with unease. Ethan watched him from the doorway, arms crossed. "You've got something, don't you, boy?" Inside the evidence room, the suspect's belongings had been tagged and sealed. A wallet that carried only a few bills, a plaid shirt, and a jacket heavy with wear. Rook nosed at the metal locker, whining low, pawing once, then again, his agitation growing. Ethan opened the door and pulled out the jacket, laying it across the table. The shepherd's nose went to the collar, then the seams, and he barked once, sharp, decisive. Ethan frowned. He had worked cases long enough to trust that reaction. He fetched a utility knife from his desk. The seam along the inner lining felt thicker than it should, the stitching uneven. He sliced carefully, pulling the fabric apart. Inside, folded tight and smelling faintly of oil and damp earth, was a slip of paper. Ethan unfolded it slowly, his gray eyes narrowing as he scanned the crude lines. It was a map, drawn by hand, highways sketched with uneven strokes, a few notes in block letters, and a red X marked near the words, Silver Ridge, Rest Stop. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her tall frame filling the narrow space. She had traded her gray sweater for a plain navy coat, her auburn braid draped across her shoulder. Her face carried the tired look of someone who hadn't slept, but her eyes were still steady, alert. "What did you find?" she asked. Ethan held up the map. "Looks like someone's been keeping secrets." Before Ethan could say more, the precinct captain arrived. Captain Willis was a broad man in his late 50s, with thinning black hair, a square jaw, and eyes that carried the permanent weariness of command. His uniform was always immaculate, but his tone often blunt. "Cole," he said, his gravel voice cutting through the air, "I hear you've been tearing apart evidence without authorization." Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "My dog found something. You'll want to see this." He handed over. The map. Willis studied it, his brow furrowing. "Silver Ridge? That's hours out, near the state line. Could be nothing. Could be trouble." He looked up. "You're sure the dog's reaction wasn't random?" Ethan glanced down at Rook, who sat at perfect attention, eyes fixed on the captain, as though daring him to doubt. "I've learned not to question his instincts," Ethan said simply. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm but calm. "Captain, there's a pattern here. I've been tracking cases of missing children across 3 counties. They vanish without reports, no Amber Alerts, because of custody disputes or families too scared to involve the system. The details line up with this." Willis studied her, his gaze weighing her words. Sarah's tall frame and poised tone gave her authority beyond her role. She radiated the determination of someone who would not be ignored. After a long pause, Willis sighed. "All right, Cole, take your dog. Bennett, you go with them, but tread carefully. If this is connected to something bigger, we can't afford mistakes." They left before noon, Ethan driving the unmarked cruiser north along the snow-packed highway. The forest pressed close, tall pines heavy with ice, their branches rattling in the wind. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her long legs crossed, her gaze fixed on the map. "I've seen this before," she murmured. "When my brother went missing, the authorities dismissed it as a runaway. But there were notes like these, places where kids were shuffled, passed like cargo. This isn't just a coincidence," her voice was even, but the tension in her jaw betrayed the pain beneath. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, the memory of his own loss tightening in his chest. Rook sat in the back, head raised, ears alert, his breath fogging the window. Every so often he gave a soft whine, restless as though urging them faster. The miles passed in heavy silence, broken only by the crunch of tires over ice. At Silver Ridge, rest stop, the world was eerily still. The snow lay in thick drifts across the cracked pavement, and the small building, a convenience store long closed, stood with boarded windows and graffiti scrawled across its side. Ethan stepped out, his boots sinking into the frozen ground, his breath visible in the frigid air. Rook leapt from the car, nose immediately to the ground, pulling at the leash with urgency. Sarah pulled her coat tighter, her auburn braid catching the wind. "It feels wrong here," she said softly. Rook led them around the side of the boarded building to a patch of ground churned with tire tracks, half hidden beneath snow. Ethan crouched, brushing away the frost. "These are fresh," he muttered. The wide tread suggested a truck, heavy enough to leave deep impressions. Scattered near the edge of the lot were scraps, a mitten small enough for a toddler, a broken plastic bracelet, and the faint imprint of a shoe no bigger than a child's. Sarah's face paled. "They were here." A sound carried on the wind, the distant hum of a semi's engine fading into the mountains. Ethan stood, his storm-gray eyes narrowing. "They're moving them?" He pocketed the mitten, rising to his full height, his breath a white cloud against the dark trees. They spent hours combing the area, but there was little else left behind. Back in the cruiser, Sarah traced the map again, her long fingers brushing the inked X. This isn't random. These are routes. Whoever drew this has been moving children systematically. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles pale. Then we find where they're going next. As they prepared to leave, Rook froze, paw lifted mid-step, his body rigid. He sniffed the air, then pulled toward a mound of snow near the tree line. Ethan followed, digging through the frozen crust until his gloved hand struck something solid. He uncovered a small, mud-stained backpack, its zipper broken. Inside were crumbs of crackers, a crumpled drawing of a house with stick figures, and a name written in shaky crayon. Lily. Sarah's breath caught. "Lily Henderson," she whispered. "She disappeared from Idaho 2 months ago." She looked at Ethan, her brown eyes fierce with recognition. "This is proof. We're not chasing shadows anymore." Ethan stood with the backpack in his hands, the weight of it heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. The forest loomed silent around them, the cold biting, the air thick with the unseen presence of loss. But as Rook sat at his side, amber eyes burning with resolve, Ethan felt the pull of something undeniable. They were on the trail of a network that had hidden too long, and it had just made a mistake. The afternoon sun hung weakly above the Montana ridges, its light a pale disk fighting through drifting clouds. Silver Ridge Rest Stop stood abandoned, a husk of concrete and rusted metal framed by frost-coated pines. Snowmelt trickled down the cracked asphalt, pooling in ruts left by tires far larger than any sedan. Ethan Cole shut the cruiser door and scanned the scene with narrowed gray eyes. His breath steamed in the brittle air, each exhale a reminder of the cold settling into his bones. Rook stood alert at his side, the German shepherd's black and silver fur bristling, amber eyes fixed on the deserted store, as though the shadows themselves carried scent. Sarah Bennett pulled her coat tighter, the navy fabric stiff from frost. Her auburn braid, now frayed from hours in the wind, swung lightly over her shoulder as she studied the map again. She was tall and graceful in movement, but her expression was sharpened by memory, the kind of look people carried when the past still pressed against the present. "This place is a waypoint," she said, her voice low but steady. "Children don't vanish here, they pass through. Whoever we're dealing with is organized." They weren't alone for long. A state trooper's SUV rolled into the lot, headlights cutting through the white glare. Officer Carla Ramirez stepped out, boots crunching on the frozen ground. Carla was in her early 30s, a compact woman with olive-toned skin, jet-black hair cut into a sharp bob, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her uniform was practical beneath a heavy tactical jacket, and her posture carried the efficiency of someone used to dealing with long highways and sudden emergencies. She had a reputation for diligence, but also for keeping her personal life sealed off. Rumors whispered she had left behind a young son in Arizona when custody battles turned bitter. And though she never confirmed it, the quiet sorrow in her voice sometimes betrayed truth. Ramirez greeted Ethan with a nod. "Dispatch said you had something connected to a missing child?" Ethan handed her the backpack with Lily Henderson's name scrawled in crayon. Ramirez's jaw tightened as she examined it. "This is real," she muttered. "I've heard chatter about kids being shuffled up this corridor. Never had proof." As they spoke, Rook pulled toward the boarded-up store, nose to the ground. His body went taut, his scar along the flank tightening as he sniffed the base of the wall. He pawed at a spot where snow had been scraped away, revealing cigarette butts, a broken plastic comb, and the faint smell of diesel. Ethan crouched beside him, gloves brushing the frost. "Truckers use this place," he said, voice grim, "and not all for fuel." Inside the abandoned building, dust and mildew clung to the air. Shelves leaned sideways, their contents long gone, while graffiti scrawled across the walls, phrases half legible, symbols crude. Sarah ran her fingers across one. Mark, a red spiral painted over and over. "I've seen this before," she whispered. "Case notes from Spokane. They use signs like these to mark safe drops." Ramirez frowned, crossing her arms. "You're saying this is a network, not just one guy?" Sarah met her gaze, eyes burning. "Exactly. and it's bigger than Red Haven. In the back room, they discovered a crude mattress, blankets stiff with filth, and a dented thermos still faintly warm. Ethan's storm-gray eyes hardened. "They were here today," he muttered. Sarah pressed her lips together, her pale face drawn with both fury and fear. Rook gave a sharp bark, nose pressed to the concrete floor. His paws scratched at a loose tile. Ethan pried it open, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside lay scraps of paper, receipts from gas stations, scribbled notes of times and initials, and one Polaroid, blurry but unmistakable. A little girl with curly dark hair sat on a cot, eyes wide with fear. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photo. "This isn't Lily," she whispered. "This is someone else." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Which means Lily isn't the only one. And this rest stop isn't the end. It's the middle." Ramirez radioed in for backup, but Ethan shook his head. "Too much noise, they'll scatter. We follow quiet. We move before the trail goes cold." His gray eyes met Sarah's, then shifted to Ramirez. "You in?" The trooper gave a short nod. "If it's kids, I'm in." They stepped back outside, the shadows of the pines stretching long across the snow. The highway hummed faintly in the distance, the occasional semi barreling past, oblivious to the secrets hidden just off the road. Ethan leaned against the cruiser, rubbing his gloved hands together. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Sarah finally broke it. "You never told me about her," she said softly. Ethan stiffened. He knew what she meant. His daughter. The memory still clawed at him, her laughter in the back seat of the car, the sudden crash, the silence that followed. He closed his eyes briefly, his jaw working. "She was 8, he said at last, his voice rough. "Her name was Claire." One drunk driver ended her world, and mine. Sarah's brown eyes softened, and in them Ethan saw not pity, but recognition. "When my brother vanished, people said my family should move on. That kids get lost, but I never forgot. Never will. That's why I stayed in this work, because somebody has to refuse to forget." Her words were steady, but her shoulders trembled slightly, a crack in her otherwise composed frame. Rook broke the heaviness with a bark, pulling toward the tree line. Ethan followed, boots crunching. At the edge of the woods, half buried in snow, was a discarded tarp stained with oil. Beneath it, they uncovered crates, empty but marked with shipping codes. Ramirez snapped photos, her sharp eyes scanning for clues. These are freight numbers. They could trace the routes. Ethan brushed frost from one, muttering the digits aloud. "If they're moving kids like cargo." His voice trailed into silence. The sun began to dip, painting the snow in hues of blood orange and violet. They gathered the evidence, knowing it was only the surface of something deeper. As they prepared to leave, Sarah stood staring at the road where trucks roared past. Her tall frame cast a long shadow across the snow. "They think nobody sees," she said quietly. "That children can disappear without voices, without names. But we're here, and now they've left a trail." Ethan glanced at her, then at Rook, who sat with ears pricked, his breath fogging the dusk air. The shepherd's amber eyes locked on the horizon, as though he already knew where the path would lead. And Ethan, hardened by grief but pulled forward by duty, felt something shift. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was a vow, forged in the frozen silence of a rest stop that held too many ghosts. By the time night settled across Silver Ridge, the last threads of daylight had surrendered to a low-hanging fog that clung to the tree line like a veil. Ethan Cole drove the unmarked cruiser slowly along the narrow road that cut through the mountains, his storm-gray eyes locked on the winding pavement ahead. Beside him, Sarah Bennett studied the Polaroid photo again, her long fingers tracing the blurred outline of the child's face, as though contact might summon her back. In the back seat, Rook shifted restlessly, the black and silver German shepherd's ears flicking, his amber eyes never still. He had not relaxed since they left the rest stop, his body thrumming with an energy that Ethan had learned to trust more than maps or hunches. They weren't alone this time. Trooper Carla Ramirez followed in her SUV, its headlights cutting twin beams through the fog. Carla's sharp profile, framed by her bob of black hair, was etched in determination. She had insisted on coming, her voice steady with the kind of resolve that came only when the stakes were personal. Ethan didn't argue. He knew by now that every set of hands mattered. An hour into the drive, Rook began to whine low in his throat, his nose pressed against the window. Ethan slowed, scanning the shoulder of the road where a dirt track veered sharply into the woods. The path was half hidden by overgrown brush and the residue of old snowfall, but it was enough. Rook barked once, sharp and decisive. Ethan pulled over. Ramirez parked behind, stepping out into the biting air with her flashlight. "Looks abandoned," she muttered. Ethan adjusted his coat collar against the wind. Or meant to look that way. The dirt track led them deeper into the woods until it opened into a clearing. There, half buried beneath moss and ice, was the mouth of an old storm shelter, its concrete roof cracked, its steel door chained shut. Rook growled, his body low, tail stiff, ears pricked forward. Ethan shone his flashlight across the door, the beam catching faint markings. A spiral painted in the same red as the graffiti at the rest stop. Sarah's voice was tight when she spoke. Same symbol. It's a drop site. With Ramirez's help, they cut the chain and pushed open the door. A foul, musty odor rushed out, thick with mildew, sweat, and something metallic. The narrow stairs descended into darkness, walls damp and lined with exposed pipes. Ethan led the way, flashlight steady, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. Rook stayed close, his nails clicking softly against the concrete steps. Sarah followed, her tall frame hunched against the low ceiling, her expression a mix of fear and determination. Ramirez brought up the rear, her beam sweeping across every shadow. The bunker was worse than they imagined. Bare concrete walls held back the earth, the air stale and cold. In one corner, thin mattresses were laid side by side, their fabric stained and sagging. Against the wall, a line of tiny shoes sat neatly, each pair unmatched, as though taken hastily from different lives. Sarah froze, her brown eyes wide, her breath caught. "Oh, God!" From the shadows came a whisper, faint and trembling. "Is he gone?" Ethan swept the beam across the far corner. Behind a pile of blankets, 3 children huddled together, 2 boys and 1 girl, none older than 10. Their faces were gaunt, eyes wide, cheeks hollow from hunger and fear. The oldest, a boy of about 10 with tousled dark hair and a bruise along his jaw, stepped forward slightly. His clothes were torn flannel, his sneakers caked with dried mud. He spoke again, voice raspy but firm. "Is he gone?" Ethan lowered his flashlight, softening his tone. "You're safe now? We're with the police." Rook moved closer, sniffing gently, his tail easing into a softer wag. The children's eyes followed the dog with something close to relief. Sarah dropped to her knees beside them, her long limbs folding awkwardly as she reached for the smallest, a girl no older than 5, with tangled blonde hair and a scraped cheek. Sarah's voice was steady but tender. "You're safe now, sweetheart. No one's going to hurt you." The child clung to her arm, burying her face into Sarah's coat as if she had known her forever. Ethan watched, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in years, hope, fragile and raw. Carla Ramirez checked the rest of the bunker, her flashlight sweeping across crates stacked in the corner. She pried one open, revealing rows of small plastic water bottles and sealed packets of crackers. "Stockpiled," she muttered grimly. "They were preparing to keep kids here for days." Her sharp eyes shifted to Ethan. "This isn't just a rest stop. It's a storage unit." They led the children up into the freezing night. The oldest boy gave his name, Michael, and said they had been taken from a campground 2 nights earlier. He couldn't say where the man had gone, only that he promised to come back with more. Sarah's tall frame seemed to envelop them all, her auburn braid falling loose as she wrapped her coat around the youngest. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. Rook circled them, his black and silver coat gleaming in the flashlight beams, his posture both protective and calming. The German shepherd pressed his muzzle into Michael's small hand, and for the first time, the boy smiled faintly, his shoulders lowering from constant tension. Ethan caught the moment, storing it deep inside himself like a candle against the dark. They loaded the children into Ramirez's SUV, Sarah climbing in with them to keep them calm. The vehicle became warm with whispered reassurances, the crackle of blankets, the soft hum of Sarah's voice. Ethan stood outside with Rook, his breath visible in the cold night, his gray eyes fixed on the bunker's door still hanging ajar. There was more down there, more evidence, more horror, and more trails to follow. But for now, 3 lives had been pulled back from the shadows. As the convoy prepared to return to Red Haven, Ethan placed a hand on Rook's strong neck. "Good work, partner," he murmured. Rook leaned into him, amber eyes glowing in the dark. For Ethan, it was enough, for now. The convoy returned to Red Haven under a midnight sky veiled with drifting snow. The headlights cut long beams through the dark, and the rhythmic sound of tires on frozen asphalt filled the silence between them. In the back of Ramirez's SUV, the 3 rescued children slept restlessly, their heads pressed against Sarah's shoulder. She had wrapped them in thick blankets, her tall frame curved protectively around the smallest. Sarah's auburn braid had loosened completely, strands of hair falling around her pale face. But she looked calmer here than she had all day, as though her body had finally found its rightful purpose. At the precinct, the children were taken to the care of a local emergency shelter, where social workers, 2 women with lined faces and tired eyes, welcomed them with gentle hands. One of them, Margaret Doyle, a stout woman in her 60s with silver curls and the warm but commanding voice of someone who had raised 6 children of her own, greeted Sarah with a nod of recognition. "You did good," Margaret said softly, her tone firm yet motherly. "But these kids will need more than warm beds." Sarah squeezed her hand in return, her tall, willowy frame bent slightly in exhaustion. "I'll come tomorrow to help them settle," she promised. Ethan stayed behind at the precinct with Rook. The German shepherd, usually indefatigable, lowered himself heavily onto the cold linoleum floor, his thick black and silver coat rising and falling with labored breaths. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the evidence board, almost as if he knew the battle wasn't done. Ethan crouched beside him, running his rough hand along the scar on Rook's flank. "You've given me everything tonight, partner," he murmured, "but I can't ask you to burn yourself out." Yet he knew in his bones Rook would never stop until they had pulled every child back from the shadows. The next morning, sunlight broke weakly over Red Haven, glinting off the frost that clung to the town's rooftops. In the captain's office, Ethan, Sarah, and Ramirez reviewed what they had gathered: the battered Polaroid, the crates with shipping codes, the red spiral graffiti, and now 3 living children, all proof of a coordinated network. Captain Willis listened in silence, his square jaw tight, his thinning black hair combed back in an attempt at composure. "We can't keep this local anymore," he said at last, his gravel voice low. "I'll notify the task force, but until then, I want you 3 to follow up on that rest stop trail." His eyes flicked to Sarah. "And Ms. Bennett, you're not law enforcement. If you keep inserting yourself, you're putting yourself at risk." Sarah straightened her tall frame, her brown eyes steady. "With respect, Captain, I've already seen too many cases ignored until it's too late. I'm staying." Willis's lips thinned, but he didn't argue further. Later that day, Ramirez brought Ethan. Security footage collected from a gas station 60 miles north. The grainy black and white video showed a semi idling at the pump. A man in his 40s with a gaunt face and a wool cap exited the truck, his posture quick and defensive. He led a girl by the arm, no older than 6, her curly hair spilling from beneath a knit cap. Ethan's storm-gray eyes hardened. "Not the same guy from Red Haven." Ramirez nodded grimly. "Another link in the chain?" They traced the truck through highway records, its mismatched plates flagged at multiple checkpoints but never held. Each stop was short, efficient, and always near isolated areas. The trail stretched like a vanishing line across counties. Meanwhile, Sarah spent her afternoon with the rescued children. In the shelter, she sat cross-legged on the floor beside Michael, the oldest boy with bruises along his jaw. She handed him a sketch pad and crayons. "Sometimes drawing is easier than talking," she said gently. Michael, his dark hair falling into his wary eyes, hesitated, then began to draw. His hand moved slowly but deliberately, shaping a square with wheels, then adding barred windows. When he turned the page, Sarah's heart clenched. The child had drawn a trailer, unmistakably like the one seen in the gas station footage. Sarah brought the sketch straight to Ethan, who was poring over the evidence board. Her tall figure leaned against his desk, auburn strands escaping around her face. "He's telling us where they were kept," she said. Ethan studied the drawing, his chest tight. "This confirms it. They're using refrigerated trailers. That's how they move them, unseen." As night fell again, Ethan sat in the empty squad room with Rook stretched across his feet. The shepherd's breathing was shallow, his powerful body finally showing fatigue after 2 relentless days. Ethan stroked his head, feeling the warmth of loyalty radiate from the animal. "I won't leave you behind," Ethan whispered. He remembered the night his daughter had died, how powerless he'd felt, how silence had filled every corner of his life afterward. But with Rook, there was never silence. There was always the heartbeat of duty, the bark that broke through despair, the reminder that not all battles were lost. Sarah appeared at the doorway, her frame lit faintly by the hallway lamp. "He needs rest," she said softly, nodding toward Rook. Ethan looked up, his gray eyes weary but unyielding. "So do you." She gave a faint smile, a curve of lips tinged with sadness. "Children don't wait, and neither can we." Together, they stared at the map, at the trail that slipped further north. Outside, Red Haven slept under snow and silence. But in Ethan's heart burned a new vow, that no matter how far the trail vanished, he and Rook would follow it until every child was accounted for. The convoy returned to Red Haven, under a midnight sky veiled with drifting snow. The headlights cut long beams through the dark, and the rhythmic sound of tires on frozen asphalt filled the silence between them. In the back of Ramirez's SUV, the 3 rescued children slept restlessly, their heads pressed against Sarah's shoulder. She had wrapped them in the thick blankets, her tall frame curved protectively around the smallest. Sarah's auburn braid had loosened completely, strands of hair falling around her pale face. But she looked calmer here than she had all day, as though her body had finally found its rightful purpose. At the precinct, the children were taken to the care of a local emergency shelter, where social workers, 2 women with lined faces and tired eyes, welcomed them with gentle hands. One of them, Margaret Doyle, a stout woman in her 60s with silver curls and the warm but commanding voice of someone who had raised 6 children of her own, greeted Sarah with a nod of recognition. "You did good," Margaret said softly, her tone firm yet motherly. "But these kids will need more than warm beds." Sarah squeezed her hand in return, her tall, willowy frame bent slightly in exhaustion. "I'll come tomorrow to help them settle," she promised. Ethan stayed behind at the precinct with Rook. The German shepherd, usually indefatigable, lowered himself heavily onto the cold linoleum floor, his thick black and silver coat rising and falling with labored breaths. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the evidence board, almost as if he knew the battle wasn't done. Ethan crouched beside him, running his rough hand along the scar on Rook's flank. "You've given me everything tonight, partner," he murmured, "but I can't ask you to burn yourself out." Yet he knew in his bones Rook would never stop until they had pulled every child back from the shadows. The next morning, sunlight broke weakly over Red Haven, glinting off the frost that clung to the town's rooftops. In the captain's office, Ethan, Sarah, and Ramirez reviewed what they had gathered: the battered Polaroid, the crates with shipping codes, the red spiral graffiti, and now 3 living children, all proof of a coordinated network. Captain Willis listened in silence, his square jaw tight, his thinning black hair combed back in an attempt at composure. "We can't keep this local anymore," he said at last, his gravel voice low. "I'll notify the task force, but until then, I want you 3 to follow up on that rest stop trail." His eyes flicked to Sarah. "And Ms. Bennett, you're not law enforcement. If you keep inserting yourself, you're putting yourself at risk." Sarah straightened her tall frame, her brown eyes steady. "With respect, Captain, I've already seen too many cases ignored until it's too late. I'm staying." Willis's lips thinned, but he didn't argue further. Later that day, Ramirez brought Ethan. Security footage collected from a gas station 60 miles north. The grainy black and white video showed a semi idling at the pump. A man in his 40s with a gaunt face and a wool cap exited the truck, his posture quick and defensive. He led a girl by the arm, no older than 6, her curly hair spilling from beneath a knit cap. Ethan's storm gray eyes hardened. Not the same guy from Red Haven, Ramirez nodded grimly. Another link in the chain? They traced the truck through highway records, its mismatched plates flagged at multiple checkpoints but never held. Each stop was short, efficient, and always near isolated areas. The trail stretched like a vanishing line across counties. Meanwhile, Sarah spent her afternoon with the rescued children. In the shelter, she sat cross-legged on the floor beside Michael, the oldest boy with bruises along his jaw. She handed him a sketch pad and crayons. "Sometimes drawing is easier than talking," she said gently. Michael, his dark hair falling into his wary eyes, hesitated, then began to draw. His hand moved slowly but deliberately, shaping a square with wheels, then adding barred windows. When he turned the page, Sarah's heart clenched. The child had drawn a trailer, unmistakably like the one seen in the gas station footage. Sarah brought the sketch straight to Ethan, who was poring over the evidence board. Her tall figure leaned against his desk, auburn strands escaping around her face. "He's telling us where they were kept," she said. Ethan studied the drawing, his chest tight. "This confirms it. They're using refrigerated trailers. That's how they move them unseen." As night fell again, Ethan sat in the empty squad room, with Rook stretched across his feet. The shepherd's breathing was shallow, his powerful body finally showing fatigue after 2 relentless days. Ethan stroked his head, feeling the warmth of loyalty radiate from the animal. "I won't leave you behind," Ethan whispered. He remembered the night his daughter had died, how powerless he'd felt, how silence had filled every corner of his life afterward. But with Rook, there was never silence. There was always the heartbeat of duty, the bark that broke through despair, the reminder that not all battles were lost. Sarah appeared at the doorway, her frame lit faintly by the hallway lamp. "He needs rest," she said softly, nodding toward Rook. Ethan looked up, his gray eyes weary but unyielding. "So do you." She gave a faint smile, a curve of lips tinged with sadness. "Children don't wait, and neither can we." Together they stared at the map, at the trail that slipped further north. Outside, Red Haven slept under snow and silence, but in Ethan's heart burned a new vow, that no matter how far the trail vanished, he and Rook would follow it until every child was accounted for. The morning broke gray and brittle over Red Haven, snowflakes drifting lazily down Main Street like ash from a dying fire. The precinct hummed with a subdued urgency, every officer aware that something larger than their small town was unfolding, though most didn't know the scale. Ethan Cole sat at his desk, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the evidence board. Photographs of missing children stared back at him, connected by threads of string that spread like a spider's web. Rook lay at his feet, the black and silver German shepherd's chest rising steadily, though exhaustion dulled his amber gaze. Ethan's hand rested absently on the shepherd's scarred flank, steadying himself as much as his partner. Sarah Bennett entered, tall and willowy, her auburn hair braided loosely down her back. She carried a folder pressed against her chest, her brown eyes sharp with determination. She looked like someone carved by both sorrow and resolve, scarred but unbroken. "I pulled some records," she said, sliding the folder onto Ethan's desk. "Cases scattered across 3 states, all marked by the same red spiral we found at the bunker and rest stop." She pointed to a name that appeared in the margins of several case notes. Ellis Ward. The name hung in the air like a shadow. Ellis Ward, male, mid-40s, multiple aliases, prior charges of fraud and smuggling, all dismissed after witnesses vanished or retracted statements. In every photo, he looked different, hair long in one, cropped in another, sometimes clean-shaven, sometimes hiding behind a thick beard. But one detail remained the same. His front tooth was chipped, a jagged mark that even disguises couldn't erase. As Ethan studied the file, Ramirez stepped into the office. She carried herself with her usual compact strength, her dark bob tucked neatly beneath a wool cap. "Ward's been seen near Spokane, Boise, even Salt Lake," she said. "Never long enough to pin him, but he always leaves a trail, burner phones, gas receipts, motel rooms paid in cash." She dropped a manila envelope onto the table. "And this. A truck stop camera outside Missoula, Grainy, but look at the shirt. Ethan leaned closer. The footage was blurred, but clear enough to see a man in a plaid shirt, red and black, guiding a child by the hand toward a refrigerated trailer. The man turned briefly toward the lens, and though the cap shadowed most of his face, the chipped tooth glinted in the light. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's him. Sarah's long fingers gripped the edge of the desk. He's not just a courier. He's the architect. He runs this. Her voice was calm, but threaded with a fierce intensity. Ethan looked at her, seeing not only her determination, but also the tremor of risk. Sarah wasn't a cop. She had no badge, no weapon, only a heart too stubborn to step aside. That scared him more than the face of Ellis Ward. Later that afternoon, Sarah insisted on visiting the Asta shelter again. Margaret Doyle greeted her at the door, her silver curls glowing under the warm yellow light. The children clung to Sarah as soon as she stepped inside. Michael, the boy with dark hair and bruises, showed her another drawing, this time of a man with a crooked smile and a jagged tooth. Sarah's breath caught. She crouched low, her tall frame folding gently as she asked, "Was he the one who took you?" Michael nodded, his eyes dark with fear. When Sarah brought the drawing back to the precinct, Ethan felt both gratitude and dread. Gratitude that Michael's memory confirmed the face of Ellis. Dread because Sarah had walked into danger without flinching, pulling herself deeper into the current. "You don't have to do this," he told her, his voice low, his storm-gray eyes fixed on hers. She stood tall, her auburn braid catching the light. "I already told you. I refuse to forget children like my brother, and neither should you." That night, the task force finally called back. Agent Russell, a broad-shouldered man with dark hair peppered with silver, arrived from Helena. His tailored coat and precise manner carried the weight of federal authority. But his eyes were tired, marked by too many cases unresolved. He spread maps across the table, his baritone voice calm but decisive. Ellis Ward is running a network that stretches across state lines. He launders his routes through freight companies, uses refrigerated trailers to move children undetected, and pays couriers in cash. We've been chasing him for years. This, he tapped the photo of the Polaroid Sarah had found, is the closest we've come. Ethan leaned forward, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the map. "So we go after him." Russell shook his head slowly. "Not yet. We need more than fragments. If we move too soon, we'll lose him again." Ethan's jaw clenched, his storm-gray eyes flashing. Children don't have time for patience. As the room filled with the hum of tension, Rook stirred at Ethan's feet. The German shepherd rose, tail stiff, ears pricked toward the evidence board. He sniffed the air, then pawed at the corner where Ellis Ward's name had been pinned. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Sarah's brown eyes softened as she watched. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows that face." Later, when the precinct had quieted, Ethan walked Sarah to her car. The night was bitterly cold, the stars faint through the drifting clouds. She stood tall beside him, her long frame outlined in silver light, her auburn hair loosening from its braid. "You're not going to stop me from helping," she said quietly. Ethan looked down at Rook, then back at her. "I know," he admitted, his voice rough, "but it doesn't mean I'll stop worrying." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hid sorrow but carried warmth. "Worry all you want, Ethan. Just don't let it slow us down." And with that, she climbed into her car, her determination cutting through the cold like fire. As Ethan stood in the frozen lot, Rook pressed against his leg, his amber eyes locked on the night horizon. The shepherd's breath steamed in the air, a silent vow between them. Ellis Ward was out there, moving in shadows, but his face was no longer hidden, and Ethan knew that sooner or later they would stand across from him. The mountains were quiet now. Where once the wind had screamed through the pines and bullets had torn through the cabin walls, only silence lingered, broken by the occasional cry of a child and the shuffle of boots on snow. Red and blue lights bathed the clearing as federal agents and state troopers secured Ellis Ward, his gaunt face twisted in defiance even as the cuffs bit into his wrists. The chipped front tooth, the detail that had haunted files for years, gleamed faintly beneath the glare of headlights. He was beaten, but his eyes remained cold, a silent reminder that shadows still stretch beyond these woods. Ethan Cole stood apart, his storm-gray eyes scanning the scene. His heavy coat was ripped at the shoulder, blood seeping through the fabric where Ellis's elbow had struck him, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the children, bundled in blankets, ushered gently toward waiting vehicles. Sarah Bennett towered among them, her tall, willowy frame bent protectively, auburn hair falling loose around her pale face. Her voice, soft but steady, wove reassurance into their trembling hearts. "You're safe now. No one's going to take you away again." She bent to tie a child's shoe with practiced patience, and Ethan felt a pang deep inside. She had always belonged in this moment, though it had nearly broken her. Rook limped across the snow, his black and silver coat matted from the fight, amber eyes still blazing. He pressed against Ethan's leg, his breath heavy but steady. The scar along his flank glowed under the flashing lights like a badge of survival. Ethan knelt, pressing his forehead briefly to the shepherd's. "We did it," he whispered. Rook gave a low whine, the kind that spoke not of pain, but of trust, as if to remind Ethan that battles were not fought alone. Agent Russell strode toward them, his tailored coat dusted with snow, his silver-streaked hair damp from the storm. His broad shoulders carried the weight of command, and his baritone voice cut through the night. "Ward's going away for life," he said, glancing at Ethan, then at Sarah. But he wasn't lying. "This network stretches further. We'll need testimony, files, and the kids' accounts." His tired eyes softened briefly as they lingered on Sarah, her tall frame hunched among the children. "Tonight, though, you gave them back their lives. That matters." In the days that followed, Red Haven shifted. The local shelter swelled with volunteers, neighbors who once passed quietly, now arriving with blankets, food, and toys. Margaret Doyle, her silver curls shining under the fluorescent lights of the shelter, became a pillar, organizing shifts and comforting frightened children with the practiced authority of a woman who had seen both tragedy and resilience. Her laughter, deep and warm, began to echo through the halls where silence had once reigned. Sarah decided to stay. She had planned to return to Spokane eventually, but as she stood in the shelter surrounded by children who clung to her tall frame, her brown eyes softened with something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. She found a small office space near the library where she began building a non-profit dedicated to children who had fallen through the cracks of the system. Her auburn braid became a familiar sight in town, and though her frame seemed fragile at times, everyone who spoke with her learned quickly that steel lay beneath her gentleness. Her past, the missing brother, the years of restless searching, had carved her into someone who refused to yield. Ethan watched from the sidelines at first. He patrolled the streets, his broad shoulders and heavy boots a reminder of law and order. But his storm-gray eyes softened each evening when he stopped by the shelter. Sometimes he would carry in supplies, cans of food, stacks of blankets, and stand silently by the door as Sarah read stories aloud, her voice weaving hope through the children's fears. One night, when she finished, she caught him watching, and for the first time in years, Ethan let himself smile, small and weary, but real. Rook became a fixture at the shelter, too. The German shepherd, with his scarred flank and amber eyes, was adored by the children. They clung to his thick fur, whispered secrets into his ears, and laughed when he nudged them with his cold nose. Despite his limp, he moved among them like a guardian, his presence both calming and protective. Even Michael, the boy who had once refused to speak, began to smile again when Rook settled beside him at night. One evening, weeks later, Ethan, Sarah, and Rook stood together on Red Haven's main street as townsfolk gathered for a candlelight vigil. Snow drifted gently, reflecting the warm glow of flames. Captain Willis, his square jaw set firmly, spoke briefly about duty and resilience. Margaret Doyle prayed aloud for the children. Then Sarah stepped forward, her tall frame silhouetted against the lights, her auburn hair catching the glow. Her voice, clear and unwavering, carried through the cold night. "Evil hides in shadows, but tonight we prove shadows don't last. What endures is courage, and the belief that no child should ever be forgotten." The crowd bowed their heads, candles flickering. Ethan's storm-gray eyes found Sarah's, and though no words passed between them, he felt the bond carved by shared scars and shared battles. At his side, Rook sat proudly, his black and silver coat gleaming, his amber eyes reflecting the flames like molten gold. Later, as they walked home together, the quiet of the town settled around them. Ethan reached down to scratch behind Rook's ears, his rough hand brushing through the shepherd's thick fur. "Family doesn't always come the way you expect," he said quietly. Sarah, her tall frame walking steady beside him, nodded, her brown eyes soft. "But it comes. And when it does, you don't let go." For the first time in years, Ethan felt something more than duty, more than loss. He felt hope, fragile but alive, reborn in the small town of Red Haven. And as the snow fell gently over the streets, Ethan, Sarah, and Rook walked together, not as broken souls, but as a family forged in fire, carrying forward the lives they had saved and the promise of light against the dark. In the end, this story is not only about a brave officer, a loyal German shepherd, and the children who found safety again. It is about the miracles that God still works through ordinary people, and even through the animals He places in our lives. Every day, in our own struggles, we can remember that no darkness is too great when we carry faith and love in our hearts. If you believe in the power of miracles, I invite you to share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below, tell us your thoughts, and if you feel moved, write Amen as a prayer for the children and families still waiting for their miracle. Do not forget to subscribe, so together we can keep spreading stories of courage, faith, and second chances. May God bless you and your loved ones.